Bonjour à toutes, bonjour à tous.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I am Michel Lusseau. I'm a geographer and teacher at Lyon University, and I'm the director of the urban school École Urbaine of Lyon. I'm glad to welcome you for this 2-hour workshop about Anthropocene and global change, climate change, the ecosystem shift, and the question of teaching. We'll be here together for 2 hours in order to talk about these topics with colleagues from France and from the US, and about how these topics and Anthropocene, and we'll see how these terms can be coined and used. And so we'll see how these topics have an influence and an impact on teaching, on our syllabus, and on the methods that we use to raise awareness amongst our students concerning global change. And so to do so, we'll talk about our experiments as teachers, and I'm truly glad to have been able to organize this session today for this festival and this edition of 2021 with Mr. Klinenberg, who will be shown on screen because part of our participants are in remote session, and so our colleague is a director of the Institute for Public Knowledge in New York, and he has launched brainstorming activities concerning how students working on their PhDs could take into account global change in their PhDs. So that's one of the topics we're going to deal with for the 2 hours for this workshop. So before giving the floor to Eric and to all of our colleagues,
lorsque nous avons créé l'école urbaine de Lyon,
it's important to say that when we created the urban school of Lyon,
en partant de l'idée que le changement global est un tel bouleversement que, bien entendu, il change les sociétés, mais il change aussi le rapport que nous pouvons avoir à la recherche, à la construction du savoir, et qu'il changera nécessairement aussi le rapport que nous pouvons avoir à l'enseignement, et qu'il changera notre manière classique d'enseigner. Et ce, sans doute pour une raison assez simple, c'est que ce que le changement global provoque est tellement considérable qu'aucune discipline n'est véritablement capable de l'arraisonner et de le saisir seule. Toutes les réalités que nous pouvons observer en matière de changement global sont des réalités tellement complexes, les phénomènes et les faits sont tellement interreliés, et où de surcroît les faits biophysiques sont tellement interreliés aux faits sociaux et humains que cela rend impossible
factors that it makes it impossible for one and only subject
d'arraisonner, de saisir l'intégralité de ce qui doit être observé si l'on veut comprendre
what
quelque
we
chose
need to do if we
à ce
want to
changement global.
understand
Donc,
something
c'est
to global change. So of course this is something that really fueled the creation of our syllabus here at the Urban School of Lyon. So we directly from the start have wanted to develop new types of research and trainings,
le cœur de notre programme École urbaine de Lyon,
c'est no wonder why the heart of our syllabus here at the Urban School of Lyon is related to PhD. So there are 20 PhD students
des physiciens, des chimistes et des géographes, des biologistes et des sociologues, et venus essayer à travers leur doctorat d'aborder de manière totalement interdisciplinaire et pluridisciplinaire.
Cross-disciplinary
de pluridisciplinarité et d'interdisciplinarité ne sont plus tout à fait pertinents pour décrire ce qu'on essaye de faire.
Almost no longer relevant for what we want to do.
j'allais dire de sciences
we
frontières,
have wanted
les questions
to
anthropocènes.
tackle
Et c'est
these
également
questions
pour
of
ça
Anthropocene.
qu'à
And
l'école urbaine de
that's
Lyon,
why
nous
here
nous
at the
sommes
Urban
dès le
School
départ
of Lyon,
souciés de
we
la
have
façon dont
wanted
nous
from the
allions
beginning
pouvoir
to
développer
focus on
des
how
séances,
we
des
could
modules de
develop
sensibilisation des étudiants de master
awareness
de toutes
raising
les
sessions
disciplines
for
aux questions
master's
de
degree
changement global et aux
students
questions anthropocènes.
for
Parce qu'il
global
nous
warming
semblait
and the
que ces questions
Anthropocene, because
ne
we
pouvaient
thought
pas
that
appartenir à un
these
seul cursus,
questions
ne
could
pouvaient
not
pas
belong
appartenir
to
à
one and
une seule
only
discipline, que
syllabus
c'était véritablement des questions tout à fait
and
essentielles et
subject.
transversales
And so
et
they're
qu'il fallait plutôt
absolutely
viser à une sorte
cross-sectoral and
d'acculturation
transversal.
collective
So
de tous les
we thought
étudiants
that
aux
we
problématiques du changement
needed
global et aux
to
problématiques
raise
anthropocènes.
awareness amongst
Et
our students
c'est pour ça que
at that respect.
lorsque j'ai pu
And so that's
discuter avec
why
Eric Klinenberg il y a
Roy
quelques
and I
mois de sa propre
talked about
démarche
it with
autour
Eric
de la réflexion sur la
and
façon de
his
savoir
own
comment
approach
l'enseignement
on
notamment de la
how
sociologie des sciences sociales
teaching
pouvait
sociology and
lui-même
social
s'ouvrir
sciences
aux problématiques
could
du changement climatique.
open
Nous nous
itself
sommes
to
très vite
global
dit avec
change,
Eric
then
qu'il
we
fallait absolument
thought with Eric that
une séance
we needed to
d'échange,
dedicate
de
a whole
partage et de réflexion
session
autour de cette question de la
to
formation et de l'enseignement.
these
Voilà
topics.
pourquoi nous sommes
That's why we're
ensemble
here together today
jusqu'à 18h.
until 6 p.m.
Nous
here in
allons
France.
discuter via Zoom entre
So we'll talk about it
collègues ici
through
sur le plateau
Zoom
et
with
à
our
l'extérieur. Et puis
colleagues
bien sûr,
here
nous allons
and with our
pouvoir
colleagues
également répondre aux questions qui
throughout the
pourraient
world.
être posées
And
par
we'll
ceux
answer
qui
your
nous suivent
questions
sur nos chaînes YouTube,
on our YouTube
qui,
channel.
je vous le rappelle, peuvent poser des questions
Because, of
qui
course,
seront
you
ensuite
can
adressées
share
aux
your
membres
questions
du
and
plateau
comments
par la personne qui s'occupe
and
de réguler
they'll be read
justement ces questions.
by our
Voilà,
moderator.
je ne voudrais pas être plus long en
So without
introduction,
further ado,
et je vais passer la
I
parole
will give the
à
floor
Eric Klinenberg
to Eric
en direct de
Klinenberg,
New York,
live
ce matin
from
pour
New York
toi,
this morning for
peut-être
you,
que
Eric.
tu puisses préciser ce qu'il en est de la démarche que je viens d'évoquer
So you
très
can
rapidement.
give your approach about what we're going to deal with today.
Okay. Merci, Michel.
All right. Well, thanks, Michel.
Ça marche.
Is it working? Yes, it is working.
Attends. I could hear myself echoing back in English, so I had to turn off the translator.
Yep.
Thank you, Michel. It's wonderful to be here. I really miss being in Lyon for these events. To be honest, Michel, I miss being everywhere outside of my apartment these days. So I hope we can reconvene in person before too long. I'm really delighted about this seminar because the truth is that this question of how we teach and what we teach in the Anthropocene is burning, to use the metaphor that's appropriate. The idea of the Anthropocene tells us that we are living in a different place, on a different planet, and in a different period, a different geospatial period, a different ecological period. And the truth is that we're living in a different political period as well. Those of us who are calling in from the United States today, are here with a little relief of the regime, after the regime change that we've had in this country. But I think we also read the news from France that the person leading in the polls in the next French election has the last name Le Pen. And so, the political challenges before us are as formidable as the ecological ones. And I guess that's the real difficulty of teaching in this area. It's the way in which conventional fields that were separated in academic study, politics, climate, ecology, sociology, economics, all clash together and make it very difficult for us to draw boundaries and to establish expertise. One of the lessons for me as a professor who's teaching in the Anthropocene is that the idea of teaching alone and doing research alone as an individual scholar with expertise in one individual field, that idea seems outdated. The moment calls for different kinds of collaborations. It calls for both boldness intellectually and also modesty about our own individual capacities. And that's exciting and challenging. But the truth is that to teach well and to act effectively in the crisis we're in, we need to find ways to constantly learn from each other, and to share knowledge. And we also need to do it across national borders, of course, because this is not a kind of problem that you can address one nation at a time. And as we all know, too often, knowledge in higher education is organized in national silos, and we've kind of failed to take the lessons from one national academy seriously, or to integrate knowledge from different places in the way we need to. And so clearly one of the things we need to do to rise to this moment is have more collaborations like this. So I want to say very briefly before we hand it over to the extraordinary participants that we have in this seminar today, that I'm a professor of sociology at New York University. And for the last several years, I have been working very hard to train students at different levels to do work on the planetary climate crisis that has specific expression in different places. And I have organized projects to teach undergraduate students, young students between usually the ages of 18 and 24, and a separate set of programs to teach graduate students. One of them, Daniel Cohen, is now finished with graduate school and is a professor at University of Pennsylvania, and he's on this call. So we do a lot of work to train doctoral students. And I think it would be a mistake to overlook the fact that one of the big challenges for us in universities is to retrain professionals acting in different fields who themselves need to incorporate knowledge about the Anthropocene and climate change in their work. So one of the things we have done at the Institute for Public Knowledge, which I direct, is to train and retrain architects and landscape architects and city planners and engineers, who are working in professional practices that have to be transformed if we're going to get through this period. And just, on the undergraduate question, there in the United States at least, the issue for us is that we largely fail to do basic education in climate science, in students' preparatory schooling, and so it falls on university instructors to teach basic climate science, before we can get to the social challenges, and that is a big problem, and something that I try to address, but it's unsatisfying. Because it should not begin in universities. With PhD students, the one thing I want to say is that the current configuration of disciplines in the United States means that if you're studying sociology or economics or political science or anthropology, you tend to study mainly inside of those fields with people in those fields, and there's the climate change and the Anthropocene themselves do not have strong constituencies of people who are doing research in those areas. So to study the Anthropocene from any discipline is to be on the margins of that discipline at the moment, even though there's extraordinary interest in studying it and urgency on the policy side. And so I would say the most important thing that I've done institutionally at New York University is to try to organize networks of graduate students from different departments in different fields so that they can work together and build their own cohort, to build their own collaborations. And ultimately, I think in a very short period of time, they will be the ones teaching us how to do this better because their training will be better for it. And finally, the last thing I'll say is that this issue of training professionals and retraining professionals whether they're political officials or architects and landscape architecture techs or engineers, is something that we had really better think more about and use the university for, because even though this is a kind of urgent and necessary project for kind of conventional students to take on, the time frame we have for acting is short enough that if we don't retrain people who are already at work, we're not going to be able to get things done. So that's all from me for now. Again, thank you, Michel. Thank you to all of my collaborators, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
Merci Eric. Je me permets avant
Thanks very much, Eric. And before giving the floor to Natacha Gondran, who will be with us, who will be our first participant to share her experience in teaching Anthropocene, I'd like to tell you, Eric, that what you've just said about what we call professional training in France for people who already work and people with a high level of expertise is something absolutely crucial for us. And at the Urban School of Lyon, we've just launched the first cycle of professional training for graduates of Anthropocene urban auditors with a high level in the hierarchy, in civil services, in architectural divisions of the state, so that they can give their own expertise and assess the levels of Anthropocene, so that they can build scenarios to reshape our political and territorial policies. And so this is something that is probably really interesting for our social scientists around our virtual table, is that we're going to try and train these auditors, basing ourselves on what they have experienced in the field and what is being shown, for instance, an industrial land or territory not far from Lyon. So we're going to try and develop this for professionals by using a study that will help us build a diagnosis of the situation. So that's why I wanted to build up on what you've just said, Eric, because these people who already work, this is something that we need to take into consideration, not only our students, but people who already work.
I suggest to give the floor to Natacha Gondran. She's not that far from Lyon, actually. She's in the city of Saint-Étienne, so I'll give her the floor. Natacha, the floor is yours.
Merci de la prise de parole.
Thank you very much. Can you see me? Can you see my PowerPoint? Thanks a lot for this transition. As a matter of fact, yes, I'm a teacher and researcher at the École des Mines in Saint-Étienne that was set up in 1816 for training civil engineers, in particular working in the coal industry. A famous local industry in Saint-Étienne, and closely connected with the Anthropocene. So the issue of how to take into account the Anthropocene issues into an engineering curriculum. Well, as a starting point, I wanted to go back to the definition of Anthropocene, because we don't teach directly Anthropocene in our school, although since the beginning of our school, we
de son sujet sur les questions d'Anthropocène, et que dès les années 70, 80, et ça s'est ancré dans les années 90, des professeurs, bien avant moi d'ailleurs, ont commencé à se poser des questions et à intégrer dans les cours les questions des impacts environnementaux des activités d'ingénieurs, des engineering activities. Et donc, dans notre cursus, on ne va pas vraiment parler d'Anthropocène, mais on va parler
program of study, we speak of energy transition, climate change, sustainability, etc. So there is a series of teaching that deals with these issues, but not directly. Why not directly? Because we are all teachers here, and we know that lessons have to stick with our core studies. We work with young students that are experts in science, and they're very sensitive to scientific issues, and our challenge is to open them up to other types of issues, in particular social ones, and we have to give them a training that is up to their expectation. So if we want to train young people and to get them ready to work with Anthropocene issues, I think we have to have a three-tier approach. So there is a minimum basis of Anthropocene knowledge for all the students and future engineers, also to provide them with a better understanding of what is at stake, because they will work as engineers in companies, and their mission won't be to integrate the Anthropocene issues in their work, but they will have, nevertheless, to deal with them, and eventually, for some people who want to work in the transition area, to provide them with some specific skills, in particular environmental, social, and management ones, in order for them to be leaders, pioneers in transition. And it is a paradox because we tend to start by the third level, offering optional training aimed at future environmental engineers, eco-activities that used to be called 20 years ago. So we offered lessons for students working in other areas, but who were interested in integrating deeper knowledge about the environment, for instance. And actually, it was a challenge were challenged by students, because they wanted us to give them training on issues connected with climate change, because climate change being the first thing to interest our students, but we don't have a common basis to all the students. So we have redesigned our common programs of study, and this year we have integrated something like 20 hours about the basis on climate change. That because we were challenged by our former students. So the different challenges for integrating the Anthropocene issues into an engineering curriculum. First of all, the risks of pitfalls. The first one being to be sure that we give the students the knowledge that they're ready to receive and at the right time. Because if we introduce them too early in their curriculum, the risk is for them not to accept this knowledge, not to be able to comprehend them, in particular if they come from very high-level science studies. They won't be able to acquire easily social, political, democratic, and law issues, because in order to understand those issues, you have to be ready to know about these four areas. And if we introduce this knowledge too early in their curriculum, they won't be able to grasp what is at stake, the other challenge, is to know how to introduce more training on ecological and social issues without reducing the amount of hours on other issues about the job market and general knowledge on other studies. On the one hand, on the other hand, not to increase too much the number of teaching hours, and at the end of the day, without being too superficial, because our students want real knowledge. And another problem we were faced with 20 years ago is how not to be too early a pioneer. Because if we try and raise awareness too strongly among our students, we are at risk that they won't be able to get into the job market if they are too specialized as engineers. So we have to strike the right balance. The picture, the former slide, wasn't taken in our school, whereas these ones were taken in our school. So some ways to shift mindsets, so to raise awareness among our students. In order to do so, we have to have active students, not big events, to include them in the organization. Here is a document on climate change we designed together, and also to have a project approach to empower them as future engineers, and to organize meeting with different types of people, engineers, also committed citizens or local elected officials, and show them there are many different ways to work and live other than the one they're offered when they enter an engineering school. Unfortunately, lately it's been a bit challenging to organize all these events. We help them to develop a critical view on their activity, but then there is no ready-made solution, so we have to have a tailor-made approach, and also we have to make sure we're always enthusiastic and kind with our students, even if they do not share our views on climate change. They wonder a lot about their future, the future job position they'll have, and we really have to show kindness to them. So some final thoughts, but they're not final, of course. We have to acknowledge that even as teachers, we don't know everything and we don't have all the answers. This is something we always have to keep in mind. And it is necessary when we speak about such complex issues. We also have to give space to questions that are sometimes different, existential questions. We do not hesitate to stop a lesson and to start speaking of something else, because sometimes our students wonder a lot about issues that are very close to Anthropocene ones, and it's not always easy to tackle such issues when we have a big group of students. We have a maximum of 150 people in a group, and even if each individual struggles at keeping faith, we always try and share hope with our students, because we believe in positive solutions. Although we're aware of the limits, they will have their diploma summer when they're 25, and if they are hopeless when 25, their professional career will be difficult, I'm sure. Thanks a lot, Natasha, for this presentation. It's a good example of a study program for engineers in a very particular type of studies in France, which is not always something we can find in the USA or in the UK. Maybe now we could give the floor to a colleague from Northern America, from the UK. Maybe Daniel Cohen could take the floor now.
Okay, but I'm just going to introduce Daniel Cohen, who, as I said briefly before, is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, and who directs the Sociospatial Climate Collaborative. He is a dynamic writer and really tries to engage urgent political questions about how the fight for climate justice and a Green New Deal fits in with other progressive political projects. And he has recently co-authored a book called A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal. Daniel, I think, is in Philadelphia now. He's originally Canadian. And although he speaks French, I believe he's going to do this in English. So Daniel, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you. My French is not good enough to address you in French, but it's a real honor to be participating in this conversation. So I'm going to talk about some basic intellectual challenges that I've been confronting as I teach about the climate change, the climate emergency. And I think these challenges are in some ways universal. And so this should hopefully help to feed the discussion. At the beginning of my classes, I typically ask my students what they consider to be the biggest challenge in tackling climate change. And I teach in the United States to graduates and undergraduate students. And they typically say something like, the big problem is that most people don't understand climate science. And if they did, if people only understood the science, which in the United States is a challenge, then we would have pretty straightforward policy solutions and things would be a lot easier. And what I try to show the students in the teaching and in my pedagogy more broadly is that it's a lot more complicated than that. It's not necessarily just or even mainly a problem of climate science. My basic message that I try to get across is that social relations, economic systems, and political projects are the cause, and climate change is the effect. And so what we need to do, I think, in our pedagogy is focus on an actually pretty complicated cause and effect relationship between all these social causes that involve then inequalities, the nature of capitalism, et cetera, and then dealing with the consequences of that. And we want to give students intellectual tools that they can use to take some kind of action, to participate in solutions in some sense. So two big tensions sort of stand out to me that I try to tackle in this teaching, and I've designed a different course around each of them. One tension is between a very urgent emergency of carbon. That is, we have about 10 years to cut carbon emissions almost in half to have a pretty stable and safe climate. So it's extremely urgent. At the same time, the climate crisis comes out of centuries of social, economic, and political dynamics. And so we have to find some way to balance that deeper understanding with a very short-term emergency. I'm not sure that we can come up with effective tools if we don't have any sense of the history. So that's one tension. A second tension is very simple, is simply between understanding and action. What kinds of policy projects in this very specific context could be effective in reducing carbon emissions right away, and also winning some political support so that these projects can continue year after year and actually get more ambitious with each year that passes. So the first challenge is putting climate change in this broader context. So I find the Anthropocene concept extremely helpful. There are some debates about when the Anthropocene began, and in the courses I teach on the sociology of the climate emergency, I take the position that the Anthropocene starts with the colonization of the Americas. There's some solid scientific evidence that so many people in the Americas were killed by sickness and war in the 16th and 17th centuries, that the continent reforested, new forests grew, and this absorbed carbon down from the atmosphere and cooled the planet, absorbed about 7 parts per million of carbon from the atmosphere. So what we do in this class is we kind of reconstruct, for the first half of the class, a kind of history that brings us into the climate emergency. We start with a terrific book called The Human Planet that makes this argument about the Anthropocene, connects colonialism and capitalism. And what this book makes the argument, I think very convincingly, that climate change is not a result just of burning fossil fuels, but of an economic system that prioritizes productivity improvements over any other goal. And so by the time you discover fossil fuels for the Industrial Revolution, capitalist economies in Europe are already consuming massive numbers of resources in the countryside with this very intense productivity relation, doing very intensive mining, for instance, in Latin America for things like silver. And then once you arrive at fossil fuels, they come inserted into the system of extreme productivity. And that ultimately gets us to the great acceleration after World War II, where all over the world now, very intensive use of resources. A real advantage, I think, of this perspective is that it shows that, and this is the argument made in the book, The Human Planet, it shows that the issue here isn't fossil fuels just per se, but is about the economic system and the social relations around it that consider ecosystems and many categories of people disposable for the sake of economic growth. And once you have that perspective, you can start to see how racism becomes so essential for that economic system. You can see also why struggles over land are so essential in this economic system. And indeed, we know that today, about a fifth or a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions come from land use, and not just so combustion of fossil fuels is maybe 3/4 or 4/5, but you also have to understand land use. And that might actually be the hardest thing to do, is to stop deforestation in the Amazon in Brazil, stop deforestation in Indonesia. So we need that big, I think, encompassing approach. And then once we have that in this class, we then move into very contemporary social science debates, urban planning, the social psychology of climate change, sort of economic policy, carbon tax versus investment-led. And that big sweeping context, I think, really helps to ground the students, but it is also a challenge, because then the students will say things like, well, if climate change is caused by racism, by colonialism, by capitalism, then we have to massively transform the entire system to make a difference on climate. And that is, I think, at some level true, but at some level presents a real paradox, a real problem. So I try to tackle this in another course. I've co-taught this once with a planner, an urban planner, and we'll do this again. And this course is about designing specific policy projects with planning students and sociology students together to make concrete short-term interventions in the economy. So we use the framework of the Green New Deal because I agree with it. But basically here we have a different intellectual context. What we do for this class, before we talk about the specific projects, is we review the history of public-private partnerships in the United States. So what does it look like when public sector tries to cooperate with corporations to make economic change? We look at the benefits and the costs. We look at the specific examples of the United States New Deal. And we simply say, in the next few years, climate policy will be very messy. It will be full of compromise. We have to understand very precisely how the public sector makes policy change in a context of a capitalist economy with very strong corporations. And then we assemble into groups, interdisciplinary groups, and each one tackles a different section of the built environment. So in this class, we had groups working on, what do you do for a Green New Deal for housing? Another group, what do you do for Green New Deal for civic infrastructure, schools and libraries? Actually very influenced by Eric Kleinenberg's work. Another group tackled, how do you transform transportation in the United States, looking at Europe for models. And then another group looking at broad urban regional kind of territories, thinking about landscape transformation, sea level rise, that kind of thing. And they came up with really fascinating answers. One I want to raise in specific, these brilliant students talked about the importance in schools and libraries of having space for thinking about historical memory of the changing climate, where students and citizens can process in some ways the trauma of an ecological transformation that is, in many cases, devastating their communities. I hope that in the country of Pierre Nora, this idea of putting historical memory at the core of our civic institutions will resonate. And to me, that was a fascinating idea that came out of a combination of sociologists and then planners. So it's not just decarbonizing buildings, but using buildings to help us culturally, institutions to help us culturally navigate very significant changes, which are inevitable. So again, I don't want to take too much time. I want to step back and say again, the core premise here is that social relations, economic systems, political projects are the cause, and climate change is the effect. We need to focus on causes. So the last thing I'll say is I agree with some of the earlier speakers. We need interdisciplinary collaborations. We need help from climate scientists to teach the climate science to our students. So it's not people like me doing it. But I think when we want to home in on solutions, teaching practically, we want to bring a wider array of planners and social scientists together. If I could add 2 specialists to my classes right now, I would want to add first an engineer of energy systems, somebody who can really explain not just wind and solar in the abstract, but what does it concretely look like to transform an energy system in 15 years? And then the second thing would be a specialist on food systems. Food is a huge part of the climate problem. It's extremely complex, requires an understanding of ecology, of economic systems in the countryside. You can't have a discussion of food without a discussion of globalization. So where I would like to go is to really enrich the kind of social science spectrum, not on understanding changes in the atmosphere per se, but really understanding changes in the kind of material systems that underlie collective social life in the 21st century. So thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Daniel, pour cette présentation.
Well, thanks very much, Daniel, for your presentation. Now we're going to give the floor to one of our French participants. And just to build up on what you've just said, Daniel, one of the crucial points of our syllabus here at the Urban School of Lyon is to use all these types of sciences together with the ecology. And Daniel said that it was absolutely important because we could use cross-disciplinarity within our specific subjects, which is already something that is quite positive. But the Anthropocene is not only related to law or to engineering, it's a mix of everything. And I don't know what it's like in the US, but in France, there's no real tradition of cross-disciplinarity with experimental sciences, and especially in terms of teaching programs and what we should teach. And as Eric was saying earlier, we all work in silos. So that's the reason why we've invited our colleagues from Grenoble and Lyon, people working in engineering schools, in scientific departments. That's why, and this will enable our colleagues abroad to talk about social sciences. And so now I'm going to give the floor to a teacher at the engineering school of Lyon INSA, one of the main technological universities and engineering schools in France and in Lyon, and he's in charge of something quite special and specific when he created the school, when the school was created 60 years ago, and this was something that really made the school stand out from the rest of schools, is that there always has been an interest for social sciences at this school, and they study social sciences from the first year on, because after high school they can start studying these topics. So up to you, Nicholas, if you want to tell us a little bit more about it. Well, thank you very much for having me here today. So I'm a teacher, a university teacher in physics, and I've worked in in close link with what we call humanities at my school. And so now I have been the director of this center for 6 years. So I've studied physics, but I also have acquaintances, so to speak, with humanities.
En fait, je voudrais témoigner ici d'un projet.
What I'd like to share with you is a project that we're working on making our syllabus, one of our syllaba evolve, and it started a year ago. And the idea came from, the rise of these topics, environmental topics, climate change, but not only this, biodiversity, the question of resources. And so these are rising questions with rising expectations from our students.
Par exemple, nos étudiants ont été fortement mobilisés lors de la grève pour le climat.
Insofar as, a lot of our students took it to the street to talk about these topics, and there are a lot of initiatives from our teachers to talk about social sciences, climate justice. We can also talk about trial simulations about climate topics, the question of the inherent values when using some resources, eco-design lessons, and the life cycle analysis, also everything that has to do with climate. And, in 2018, there was this report of global warming by 1.5 degrees, and this was presented to the board of the school. And of course, this made this topic transformed it into an even more topical concern for the school and our students. And so the board of directors of the school decided that this should be part of our syllabus. And we decided that we needed to do something not only for some part of our students, but all of our students should receive some kind of training concerning these topics. And so that's why we started working on this and so we came up with a roadmap with around 30 colleagues, and so this was approved by the board of directors. And so what's kind of specific to our school is that this workshop has started with quite precise objectives on a 5-year scale, together with our students, with a common cycle for the first 2 years, and then they will study IT, biosciences, various types of engineering subjects. But the goal is that 100% of our students receive this training and know what are the main topics that are in a transformation process, so that this can give them levers, accessible levers from an individual point of view, but in the organizations they're going to working.
Alors, notre feuille de route maintenant.
And our roadmap
décline un peu plus précisément le périmètre sur lequel
breaks down the whole perimeter on which we work.
Mais il y a aussi les ressources.
So we, of course, deal with climate and energy, but also resources, biodiversity, human science, and human health, with air and water pollution, for instance. And try to merge engineering with social sciences, and human and social sciences, and try to work on these links between society, and try to make our students understand that the technical solutions won't be obvious, but of course they have challenges to live up to, from a social, economic, and political point of view than the technical point of view. And the last topic is the dynamic aspect of change. How,
quels sont les leviers, quels sont les déterminants
or what are the levers and the solutions for these transformations? So, of course, we don't always use the word Anthropocene, although it's gradually being more and more used. We talk about transition, environmental, ecological transition.
Entre les aspects scientifiques et techniques et les aspects,
and we try to build bridges between science and the technical field and social and human sciences as well. And so we've tried to merge all these topics with skill goals or skill levels. So in France, we are very much skill-oriented. And so we realized that we probably should deal with skills that we were not used to dealing with in the past. For instance, the skills pointed out by UNESCO in a report from 2019 concerning sustainable development goals. So there are 8 key skills, transversal skills, and we realized that we were not good at these points. So the systemic analysis of things came first, then anticipation. This is something we haven't worked a lot on, and this is something we need to develop. The third topic is the legal framework.
C'est un peu original, peut-être dans une école d'ingénieurs, au début on peut écarquiller un petit peu les yeux.
And it's quite peculiar for an engineering school. But the capacity to understand the values and the framework when it comes to making decisions on complex topics where there are conflicts of interests and where we need to compromise. So these are one of the main topics related to the Anthropocene, because sometimes it can become quite touchy and difficult. Socially and politically speaking.
Donc des objectifs de développement de compétences.
So the objectives, these are the skill development objectives that we have. So it gives you a broad picture of what we want to do. So where are we at now? So we've set goals, and it should become part of our syllabus. So that there's not much room left. We cannot add subjects to the syllabus that we have, so we won't add any more hours. We need to decrease the number of hours, actually. So we need to reduce let's say, the place of other subjects so that we can grant access to these topics for our students. And so there'll be a lot of hurdles that we need to overcome to do so. And especially if we try and use this cross-disciplinary and systemic approach, and we need to create and start from scratch for these topics and subjects, because we work by subjects, and there aren't many cross-disciplinary subjects concerning the Anthropocene. So that's what leads us to what we do in our fundamentals. Our colleagues are a bit worried, and to be honest, they're probably right. They need technical skills, and this is something that they absolutely need. So we need to deepen our technical knowledge on these social and economical topics. We can talk about the climate in a cross-disciplinary way and also train our students technically in the right way. So this is something that we need to keep working on. One of the other goals and the other challenge that we face are the silos that we work in. And sometimes we have a hard time decompartmentalizing. And that's probably one of the things that we need to overcome if we want to move forward.
ce que je voudrais peut-être évoquer également.
Another element I'd like to talk about is that we're facing an absolutely humongous challenge. You know, we're actually at the edge of a pitfall. If you want to stick to this 1.5 degree limit, we'll reach that in 10 to 12 years. So it gives you an idea of how urgent things are. And the extinction rate of species is going quicker and quicker. So, of course, we're facing extraordinary challenges. And in some way, we're a bit overwhelmed by what we need to do. And sometimes we feel that we can't do anything about it. But at the same time, we shouldn't be scared and shouldn't feel that the responsibility is only on our students' shoulders, but it's also on our politicians' responsibility and the community and society's responsibility. So we need to bring answers that are at the same level as the challenge. And the answers that we should bring should be significant face to these incredible challenges that we're facing. And so we need to talk about these things in a sufficiently consistent way inside the syllabus that we are building, and so we should do this in a very lucid way, I'd say, so that we can understand the challenges that we're facing, and it's an absolute priority. Well, thanks very much, Nicholas, for the presentation that you've just given of how global change is reshaping the way your school, one of the most important schools in France, is working. So just to remind our English-speaking participants, well, the technical training is absolutely crucial in France because historically the social, economical, and political elite were trained in engineering schools. So the syllabi in engineering schools are probably more important in France than in other university systems, because these are the university programs that are the most successful, and that's why these people then become our top leaders in the future. So please, Eric, could you please give the floor and introduce Rebecca Elliott so that she can share her experience?
Yes, well, I'm very excited to have Rebecca here. Rebecca is she's American. She did her graduate training at the University of California, Berkeley. And she's interesting in the sense that she's one of many American graduate students who basically had to do a dissertation and first major project about climate change without really having anyone on the faculty of her department who studies and does research on climate change. I don't know if that's something she'll discuss, but you know, if this is an area where you really have to do your hard work as a student in some cases, if you know there's something urgent here that you want to study but don't have the advisors and the curriculum available to you. And Rebecca managed to do that very successfully, as many people have. She has written a new book called Underwater: Loss, Flood Insurance, and the Moral Economy of Climate Change in the United States. And I hope we can distribute a link to that book so you can find it. In that book is one of parts of one of my favorite essays about climate change written by anyone in the last decade about the sociology of loss and about how we think about loss in the context of climate change in different dimensions. She's really a wonderful original thinker, and Rebecca, I'm very happy to have you here.
Thanks very much, Eric, for that really generous introduction. First, I want to express my thanks to the organizers, to Eric and Michelle, for the invitation to join today. I'm really humbled to be among some terrific educators from whom I've already learned a lot this afternoon, so thank you. When I was thinking about this panel, which was, to take up this question of our responsibility, our strategies as educators, to quote, make students understand the ethical and political stakes of the Anthropocene question. That was part of the brief for today. And I was really struck by that phrase, and I just kind of lingered there. It's a hugely important task. Michelle spoke to kind of raising awareness among students. But I think the reason it stuck out to me is that it actually hasn't been my principal challenge in the classroom as an educator and specifically as someone who teaches about climate change. I mean, to Eric's remarks at the beginning and just now, I mean, my primary challenge has mostly been convincing other colleagues in my discipline to care. And at a social sciences institution that is, it is what it says on the tin. It's dominated by economists, convincing economists that other kinds of social scientists might have some leverage on some of these topics. Because for me, I mean, with my students, they do understand the stakes. Some of them understand them more viscerally and vividly than I do, or indeed ever hope to. They've survived storms and floods and fires, and even those who haven't directly faced some manifestation of the climate crisis don't really need much convincing that there are structures in place and at work here that are pointed towards oblivion. A 20-year-old student in my classroom has, in their lifetime, already witnessed an array of system failures and has been failed by many systems. Foreclosures, bank collapses, student debt crises, sovereign debt crises, unemployment, racial and sexual violence, and now a pandemic. So systems have failed pretty spectacularly in ways that have already shaped their lives and the lives of their families, and in ways that, of course, vary tremendously depending on where in the world they're coming from and where in the social order they're situated. So in thinking about this panel, I'm a sociologist. I know all about selection bias. So I'm not proposing that this is the modal challenge for teachers of climate change. But it did lead me to reflect a little bit on the particular challenges that crop up, in a sense, after students understand the stakes. And for me, there have been many, but with the time I have here, I'll just talk about two, which has affected the kinds of themes that I emphasize in my own teaching in this area. And the first one is a challenge of imagining alternatives. And this is an intellectual challenge, but it's also a pastoral one, which I think speaks to Natasha's points about teaching with kindness and compassion. I think and write a lot about loss and climate change in my research, which necessarily takes me into pretty melancholy territory. To really understand the stakes of climate change is to contemplate all kinds of loss, the loss of places, but also routines and comforts and unevenly enjoyed perquisites and privileges. And it can seem to me that a lot of students feel when they approach climate change that they have to reconcile themselves to some impoverished notion of the good life, a kind of hemming in of their ambitions, of their expectations for the future, what they can achieve, and especially what they can acquire. And another way to think about loss is to think about letting go. So letting go of ways of living and working that seem not to make people very happy anyway, and also ensure the prosperity of the few at the expense of the many. So I actually direct students to work by my co-panelists, in fact, who've thought about the climate crisis in part as an invitation to rethink housing, work, leisure, collective life, consumption, infrastructure. Eric has shown us that investments in social infrastructure, places and spaces that are not driven by profit making, foster social connections that don't just make us happier, they could make us safer in a world shaped by climate crisis. Daniel has written about low carbon leisure, Juliet has gathered case studies of people engaging in practices of plenitude, working and spending less, connecting and creating more. So what I hope to foster in students is some critical reflection as to what they want an abundance of now and in the future. And, this is not to devolve responsibility for living well in a climate changed world to each of us as individuals, or to suggest that, we ought to be really preoccupied with our own projects of meaning making and self-actualization, but rather to say that we're going to have to organize collectively for the future that we want. And that future doesn't have to be one where we just stabilize elements of the status quo. And the second is a challenge of thinking critically about many of the ideas and things that are currently on offer as solutions or adaptations to climate change, of thinking critically not just about climate change, but about things that are done in the name of climate change. And this can be really hard, and students can be somewhat resistant to this. I think sometimes students feel, especially budding sociology students, feel that they're made to be kind of perennial killjoys. Sociologists seem really good at showing how the road to hell is paved with good intentions. But the scrutiny is important, if we don't want our carbon markets or seawalls or solar farms or aquaculture or whatever it is to further entrench extractive and exploitative relations, or to ignore or even deepen marginalizations and inequalities. Some scholars talk about these kinds of outcomes as maladaptive ones that might secure some kind of short-term protection, but create long-term vulnerabilities, or make people worse off than they were before, which is, of course, practically and ethically problematic. So for me, another challenge in the classroom, in a context where students do understand the stakes of the problem and want to do something about them, is holding space for a critical discussion of the stakes of some of these proposed solutions and adaptations too. Because in each of these projects, there's the question of whose vision of the future is being used to govern the present, and what effects does that have. And this is to really underscore something that Daniel raised, because if that scrutiny can happen in a dialogic space with engineers and planners, then I think we have reason to be much more optimistic about what some of those projects ultimately look like. And that's something that there aren't a lot of institutional spaces for that at the London School of Economics. We are a school of social scientists. And so, the opportunities for that will necessarily look different depending on the kinds of institutions we're embedded in. So just to wrap up, I'll observe that both of these challenges, I think, also speak to the way that when we teach the climate crisis, any pretense of disinterest or detachment becomes pretty untenable pretty quickly. And some students are uncomfortable with that. I think it's not exactly what they think social science is all about. And for me, I think the right response is not to claim that climate change represents a kind of legitimate exception to the rule of scientific disinterest, but rather to orient students to the way that a posture of disinterest is indeed a pretense, and it's also a political choice. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Rebecca.
Thanks a lot, Rebecca. And now, because the clock ticks, so we have to go on with our program, and now we will give the floor to Joël Chevrier, who is a teacher in physics at the Université Grenoble Alpes, a specialist of nanophysics, and he will tell us that for a few years, in parallel teaching, he's been thinking of the Anthropocene issues in his teaching and the connection we can make between teaching sciences, technology, design, and taking into account at the same time art, creativity, art, design. Joël, you've got the floor. Yes. So, on the last point, speaking of design and the relationship with arts, I want to show that I'm worried as a physicist. Nicolas is also, my neighbor is also a physicist, and I want to widen my activity beyond physics, and that translates the fact that when I see all the questions, I wonder how I can contribute. 3 points in my presentation. First of all, my stress as a physicist. What is good is that when you're a physicist, it's easy to explain. Next week, I'll start teaching thermodynamics. And I will teach literally, and I think INSA in Lyon and in Saint-Étienne, I will teach the basics of energy management in the thermo-industrial society. I will teach the theoretical basics of the thermal engines and all the thermal plants around the world, and I will do this in detail. And this is the teaching that you get when you study physics since the 19th century in any university teaching physics. Jean Joël, a famous climatologist in France, tells us that within 10 years we must have given up this type of engine. We will have to close our coal plants. So how can we change physics teaching, whereas all universities over the world teach this? Second point, what I can do now as a physicist in a movement we've seen in all the presentations this afternoon, in particular in Saint-Étienne in France and in Lyon. So I want to associate myself to transforming the work of engineers. So we've been doing that since World War II. Now it's called Energy and Environment for Engineers in Transition. For instance, environmental law, telling us how I take all the different fields and I take the methods, the questions, the training to the students in order to train specialists we need. This is my job as a university teacher. A third point is the one for which I have widened my collaboration activity, and that's why I'm here as a guest, is the third point. We've seen in the dialogue between with the presentation of Nicolas, the university teaching in France 2,700,000 students, and within 5 years we would like each of these students, so everyone, whether they're dentists, specialists in robotics, specialists in family law, having their diploma with the same approach as Nicolas, to be aware of the situation in order to participate in the national debate on climate change, the environmental collapse, and other issues, and that are very critical. So I don't know how to manage the three things. As a physicist, I'm completely out of my comfort zone for two reasons. First, how am I legitimate as a university teacher to work with students as a teacher on climate change, biodiversity, water issues, resources, etc.? As a physicist, I'm not legitimate. I don't have any specific skill to teach something, to train someone on these issues. I don't know how to do that. By the way, I don't know how, and this is my debate with designers, I don't know how, and also, as you said, Michel, beyond the training fields,
il est hors de question pour les étudiants. A dentist,
not all dentists in France can be specialists of climate change, environmental resources, etc. So I think today the issue is how to work collectively as citizens and how we can participate in the national debate and be players of the coming time. So I'm happy to be challenged by all the students who ask me, what can we do together? And I was impressed in France by what was called the Citizen Convention on Climate. 150 people from different areas of France, and some people not being trained on this issue, because these 150 people were supposed to represent French society, and I spent hours speaking with quite a lot of them, actually, and I was impressed by the fact that those people really worked as a collective, and they were not desperate after that. They were angry. And this is what we can see in the French public space. They call for action, they call politicians for action, and the format of this convention was 7 times 3 weekends. So those people learned to think together, to speak together, to validate issues, to get knowledge. And after this collective debate, they had a collective knowledge. I know what individual knowledge is, but I'm not really familiar with the notion of collective knowledge. So, in Grenoble, at university, but also in connection with my Parisian colleague of the Interdisciplinary Center for Research, what are the conclusions after this Citizen Convention on Climate, how I can acquire knowledge, how I can share this knowledge with these students, and how I can enter the collective debate in order to make decisions and to participate in this collective project. So we're thinking of, for next year, we're thinking of a citizen convention of universities involving teachers, students, experts, through MOOCs, for instance, in order to create a collective space of collective training. We won't do it once, we want to do it on a regular basis every year. We'll start an experiment for the coming 2 or 3 years in order to be able, as universities, to conclude something and to share it with all the people. Thanks a lot, for the record, for explaining to our colleagues, to our overseas colleagues, what this Citizen Convention on Climate was in France. They concluded their work with 150 proposals for the President of the Republic, challenging the public policies in order for them to be up to the expectations of the Paris Agreement. In those 150 people that were randomly chosen had no specific knowledge, but they acted as citizens, and they concluded their work with very, very interesting proposals. So interesting that they've already been forgotten by our politicians, by the way. So now our very last speaker of the afternoon, Juliette's Pickle, and she will have 10 minutes.
Okay, I'm just going to briefly introduce Professor Juliette Shore. She's actually a perfect person to wrap up our conversation, because she has already retrained herself several times in her career to address problems that she grows interested in. Her doctorate is actually in economics, but she's a professor of economics as well as a sociologist at Boston College. And she's also the chair of the board of the Better Future Project, which is a climate justice disruption organization. And Juliette has led a number of large collaborative projects in different fields especially around kind of issues related to climate and consumption, and how we think about the kind of social and political economy that drives climate change. So, Juliet, I pass it over to you.
Thank you, Eric, and thanks to everyone. This has been a really great panel, and I just thought I would try and wrap up a little bit to bring some of the threads together. I think there's been a lot of convergence among what folks have said. So to start with one point, I think one that's not particularly controversial, but which is really, crucial to thinking about both climate and the Anthropocene, and that is the need to decenter sort of siloed academic disciplines. Personally, I've been trying to incorporate multiple social science disciplines into my work, both economics and sociology, as Eric mentioned, my own disciplines, always with history, politics, and anthropology. And I would just make a small point here for social scientists, which is that I think the big problem we have right now is psychology, which has really emphasized very kind of problematic sort of universalist explanations, still too much in sort of biological determinism to contribute what it needs to a kind of much more integrated social science program. So what I might be able to add to the conversation we've had, and I think this is maybe a little bit controversial, is the need for an overarching paradigm of explanation or a kind of meta paradigm. It's very, very challenging to do. I know many people don't agree with it, but I think it's essential. If we think about one of the most powerful integrated paradigms of the post-war era, of course, it's neoclassical economics. It achieved that overarching ambition. It's a paradigm that was available to explain almost anything. It, unfortunately, I would say it did so on the basis of a faulty behavioral model, and many mistakes followed from that. It's now, I think, rightly understood as a increasingly defunct, erroneous paradigm, but its broad applicability has been a really important part of its power. And I think we need that. It's something that I think we could really gain from if we were able to get that kind of explanatory reach. So that's one point. It's how do we do that? You know, Eric talked about teaching, interdisciplinary teaching. That's something I've been doing for a long time. I teach with someone who's also an economist and a historian. I've been teaching for about 10 years on Anthropocene issues. More recently, I've added another co-teacher, someone who's a historian and an archaeologist. I would say that that sort of thrust toward history has been important for me. Daniel talked about that in his remarks. In order to get that kind of integrated understanding of what's going on, I think, history may be a, particularly important field. But I'm also collaborating with engineering colleagues on a number of projects, one on the future of work and sort of new sharing economies and algorithms, one on urban emissions and new sharing platforms. And although my remarks here are more social science oriented, in part because my teaching has not yet expanded to include engineering colleagues, I'm really finding that collaboration very fruitful, and also noting how interested engineering and science students are in the social aspects of the Anthropocene. Okay, so what do we need to understand the Anthropocene and respond? Let me be a little bit specific about a couple of areas that I think are really important. One is more integrated analysis of decarbonization and economic structure. If we look at a lot of the models that we have, either the more neoclassical, so-called integrated assessment models, or even some of the more what we call reduced form models of drivers of emissions, they largely focus on changes in energy systems and sort of very kind of inside the box changes for the economy, like changes in the rate of growth. But we really need to look at things which integrate structural features of the economy and how they can be changed. So my own work, I've looked at working hours and how reducing working hours affects emissions, or domestic inequality. But there are many other things. People are starting now to look at welfare payments, taxation, consumption patterns. Degrowth models are, I think, a good example of an approach which is basically saying, okay, we can change more than just, the very traditional kinds of let's change our fuel sources or our energy systems. So that's one thing. Of course, things are a lot more complicated because we're in a period of overlapping crises. I think one of the hopeful things is that in the political system now, we have in the United States, and I suspect in other places too, we've begun a discourse of simultaneous or overlapping crises and the need to solve them together. So crises of COVID, climate, racial justice, and economy, I think, are the four that are really most prominent at the moment. They all, of course, have connection to Anthropocene. Daniel discussed the historical narrative that links them together, but it's really important for us to kind of teach in a way that gets people to understand the common roots and the commonness among these, because there's still a lot of thinking which kind of puts them in their silos, and although people might think they're all important, they're not moving forward with analyses and solutions which address them all. One other thing I think is really important is to look at models of conflict and cooperation. And these are the two basic human factors that really are essential to grappling, what we're going to have to grapple with as ecosystems collapse, global heating progresses, threats to security intensify. Can we collaborate and cooperate as humans to mitigate emissions, regenerate ecosystems, and enhance security? So on the theoretical side, the kinds of work that's being done here is complex systems, evolutionary economics, network analysis, game theories, models of social learning. These are all really important. A lot of them are very abstract, but I think they're crucial for the Anthropocene. Because they're really key to understanding how we can productively respond to the Anthropocene rather than destructively. And in particular, theories and empirical analyses of cooperative behaviors, I think, really need to be central to our efforts. These are all those little subfields that I talked about are all very interdisciplinary with a lot of physicists, biologists, economists, social science, computer scientists. So they're really ideal in that sense. And I think part of the issue is kind of taking them from the abstract models to really thinking more about, how those work out in the real world. And one way we can do that is to sort of intensively study sort of radical cooperative alternatives. There are a lot of these proliferating around the world. They're not that easy. So we need critical analyses of them, but they need to be understood and where we can see what's really working and what isn't. Kind of like Ostrom 2.0, I guess. And I'm finding hunger among my students for doing this. I think the harder part is getting professional recognition for these kinds of studies, because there's a case study dimension to them and so forth. And that, I think, speaks also to Rebecca and Daniel's remarks. I thought I'd end with a little bit on sort of where people have talked about students and where students are at. And I thought I'd end with a little bit of reflection on where my experiences with that. And I teach both undergraduates and graduate students on these issues. I would say the first thing is I noticed this year teaching in the fall a big change in undergraduates' climate literacy and engagement. And, Eric mentioned that lack of scientific literacy. I mean, it is striking in the United States. For years, I've taught undergraduates, and our first class, we always do a climate literacy quiz. And honestly, these students didn't know the slightest thing. I mean, basically, ozone hole versus climate change, early on we were at that level of ignorance. That's really changed. When we did our first day climate quiz this year, they got most of the answers, first time ever. And I do think the school strikes of 2019 have been responsible for a big shift in incoming undergraduates. I mean, we'll see if that's, this year we're virtual, but, if that youth movements really continue to take root, I think that's going to be great. And the second thing, which has been a big theme, in terms of teaching undergraduates and really speaks to Rebecca's work, is paying attention to their emotions, because you cannot teach this material if you don't pay attention to their emotions and really get it out there how difficult it is, how paralyzing, depressing, traumatizing, etc. Learning about this stuff can be, and then at the same time engaging them, because the engagement is the antidote to all of those negative emotions. So we do stuff on, telling them you're going to have, when we introduce some of the, more disturbing material, you're probably having these emotions and go through them and so forth. And I learned the hard way the first time we taught this stuff without that. So we learned, number one, to put the solutions all through the class. As soon as you teach a problem, you teach alternatives and solutions with it. So that's really important. Secondly, you have to give them engagement as you're teaching. So for undergraduates, we start with the lowest common denominator stuff, which is the individual behavior change. So we have an eating challenge. I'm teaching a class this semester. I teach at a Jesuit university, so we're doing a Lenten spending fast. But, just whatever it is, anything that relates to your class material, it's actually very meaningful to them, even as they understand it's not going to make that much of a difference, but it allows them to feel engaged. Taking them to demonstrations. We did that for the first time with the climate strikes, which was so powerful for many of them. For many of them, their first time ever. We engage with city government or nonprofits on project-based things. We've done climate mitigation and adaptation projects with the city, and this year we did a Green New Deal for the city with an NGO. So I just think giving them some real world engagement is increasingly important. I'm also less concerned about being non-political, objective, scholarly than in the past. I think we have to really, kind of put ourselves out there. And I think the university discourses around pedagogy are really understanding that. For graduate students, that means supporting their public and activist work and not just their scholarly products. And that's really important for us. And graduate students are looking to faculty to be models of engaged scholars and activist scholars. So the last thing I would say is, and maybe this is, adds on to what we've said. Most of what I've said really is not, different from what's been said by others today. An urgent need for disruption in both the intellectual and the political spheres. In the United States, the defeat of Trump has been a tremendous relief, and Biden has been much better than we could have hoped for, but he represents a return to normalcy, to Paris, to consensus legislation, to continued North-South inequality, to not recognizing the depth of the Anthropocene. Certainly, it's a more urgent normal, which of course it has to be. But when we look at the scale of what the Anthropocene means for ecological as well as non-ecological crises, it's clear that a return to normalcy, even an urgent normal, will seal our fate. So we need to disrupt. And it's risky, especially for graduate students. But I think we all have to be prepared to take more risks to create this disruption, whether it's to our everyday comfort, to our wallets, for those of us who are financially comfortable, to our professional reputations. It is a time to be bold. The Anthropocene demands it. Thank you.
Merci Juliette. Merci à tous et à toutes.
Thanks very much, Juliette, and thanks very much to all of you for all of your presentations. And it was absolutely fascinating, and it converged, even though your positions were different and your stances were a little bit different. Well, we have a short period of discussion. Of course, you will probably find this is too short because we could carry on for hours, but we have 25 to 26 minutes to start the debate. And first, I'd like to know whether there are questions from our audience. Are there any questions or comments?
Alors, une question qui a été posée, c'était comment on peut...
One of the questions that we received is how can we reconcile university time schedules and the feeling that sometimes students can get is that they don't have the capacity to act, and the possibility, despite all of this, to build a program concerning the Anthropocene. Well, I think we've all talked about this. The idea of making students, of becoming agents and people who are able to act. Eric, maybe you can answer that question. Maybe something all of our panelists will agree on is that we can no longer work on the traditional academic with the traditional academic structure that we have with exams, etc. But the capacity for our students once they graduate, the capacity for them to become activists towards and in favor of climate change and global change. What do you think, Eric?
Well, I mean, I think this is a very difficult problem, and I do think that there is unquestionably an urgency around action, and that many of the things we ordinarily say about the timing of academic research, about the distance between academic teaching and social praxis, those things have broken down. At the same time, I get a little nervous when I hear people say we have a 10-year window to handle climate change and then it's over. I don't think that's quite right. The truth is that we are going to be living in this crisis from now on, and we will have an ongoing series of challenges that will require us to kind of retool and reorient. And so I think that there's a danger for climate, just as there was a danger with COVID, that things that seem immediately appealing, things that we think might work, like the hydrochloroquine for climate change, at the end of the day are not going to be as effective as other things. And so we still need to be doing our best work. We still need to, we need rigor more than ever. We need to really make sure that we're right. And so the danger I'm concerned about is that we cut corners and act like, we have a deadline of tomorrow, when in fact, a lot of us, we really do need to be doing the best and most careful work. So yes to breaking down the wall between the academic world and the world of practice. Yes to prioritizing what people sometimes call applied social science research. There's a stigma around applied research in many areas where it's seen as not intellectually serious as as intellectually serious as basic research. That makes no sense in a climate changing world. But I just would caution us against the idea that we have to throw out and blow up the whole institution and take to the streets, because we're going to need better science than ever, and that's going to take some time.
Est-ce que quelqu'un veut également réagir?
Does anyone else want to add up to this?
I'd like to call Juliet into this because I saw her reacting on my screen.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think that and part of what I was trying to say was how much we need to do to understand what's going on, because this is a very new situation. And so, studies of many types, I think there's, we're even at the point of like still trying to understand what it is that we don't know. And so that, so absolutely couldn't agree more.
Mais peut-être juste avant de passer la parole à Joël, ce qui est intéressant de dire.
So maybe before giving the floor to Joël, I can tell you that we set up the program of the urban school in Lyon because we understood that there was a gap, a lack. We needed to understand what Anthropocene is in relation with urban planning, and we also want to raise awareness among our students that they are part of these dynamics, this evolution. They shouldn't watch from outside Anthropocene. They have to be part of it to understand it because they're within the social life. And this is how we will evolve the evaluation model of academic studies, because there are players and victims at the same time of what is happening, and this is where we've got margin for maneuver. And Joël, this is what I wanted, this is what Joël said when he spoke about the citizen convention of students, because the analysis, the scientific part of what is happening should be connected with the individual experience of each person on Earth, and that is a victim of the evolution of bioclimate change. Maybe we could go back to what you've said. I understand what you've said, and I'm sorry if I didn't explain myself clearly. I don't think that we have 10 years to change the situation. I think that as an academic and researcher, I think I'm able to accompany my students. I think I can accompany them in order for them to acquire knowledge and to teach them how to find this knowledge, how to validate this knowledge, to keep safe from fake news, and to work collectively on knowledge from different fields. And secondly, I don't feel that much at ease when I want to make them understand make them understand that on these issues we don't have ready-made answers. Universities don't have such answers. It's only through engagement of societies, of students, and we teachers, we can accompany them, equip them in order for them to be real players involving debate, action, project, collective. So these are 2 points in order for us to organize a collective shared knowledge where we can constantly, as researchers do, validate, build this common base as a base of democratic systems. And in order to do so, as a specialist in physics, I don't know how to do this. And this is a pedagogical project to accompany students in this movement. Maybe, Nicolas, you want to take the floor, and we've got some more questions arriving. Yes, in a nutshell, I definitely agree with what you've said. And I also think that there is a political challenge in our universities. Without any doubt, we've got to assume the fact that among our different missions, we have to think of the challenge of Anthropocene beyond our field of expertise. And this is something we have to do for the students. And we have to work among colleagues to work for students, because we have to open the doors in order for that students to collaborate with us, teachers. And before taking the next question, I invite Rebecca, to react, because in her speech, she insisted, ironically, on the fact that it was more difficult to convince her colleagues and not that much difficult to convince the students, to convince the colleagues of having a cross-disciplinary approach and work together. How can you overcome this challenge in an institution such as the London School of Economics?
Thanks very much. I mean, I suppose the short answer is I'll let you know once we do it. But one of the things we've tried is to create another kind of forum for social scientists around the school to convene to talk about climate change. And we call it the social life of climate change. At the LSE, the Grantham Institute, which is largely economists, has actually been, pretty hospitable to this. And the idea is that, there are many different methods and kind of styles of inquiry that give us some purchase on some of the questions that we share. And I think what's really important about that as it relates to teaching is that it signals actually to graduate students that there is a home for this kind of research at the LSE where previously there wasn't. And we've had a lot of interest and participation from not just our PhD students across a number of different departments, sociology, anthropology, development studies, gender, but also from master's students who maybe not on a trajectory into research as a vocation, but who are trying to equip themselves with some skills to go on to careers of all kinds.
Mm-hmm. Merci beaucoup. Nous avons
Thanks a lot for your input. So we've got a series of questions aiming at the same point, and I would like to ask Daniel and Natasha, because I'm thinking of you through your expertise and your presentations. Somebody wonders how this new proposal for research and teaching, how can we organize in order to be heard by the politicians when we speak about radical change? Because politicians are a bit reluctant. We've spoken about the Citizen Convention on Climate, or our US colleagues have spoken of what the political situation in the USA used to be not a long time ago. So maybe Daniel could react, as your presentation was deeply focused on the need to raise awareness of the necessary political change, and maybe Natasha Gondran, what she thinks about this, because she's had to give her viewpoint in order to accompany political decisions.
Thank you very much for this question. I think one key piece of this, and Julie alluded to it in her presentation, is the student movement. In France, in the UK, in the United States, students are important political actors. So Julie mentioned the climate strikes. In the United States, we have this movement, Sunrise. But 4 years ago, two activists with the Sunrise movement, sort of 20-year-olds, slept on the floor in this room, actually, which is my office. One of my the bedroom I don't sleep in. But they slept on the floor and they talked to my class about why they were so passionate about climate activism. And that was the spring of 2018. And I thought, these kids are very passionate. In 5 or 6 years, their movement might go somewhere. And within a few months, they were occupying Nancy Pelosi's office, very prominent politician here, with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and launched the Green New Deal. And Julie alluded to President Biden's pretty progressive climate policies so far, and that's pretty much entirely because of students between the ages of 18 and 22. So I think there's that important piece of it, is students being able to mobilize. I think another important piece is helping students understand that that kind of spectacular activism isn't their only path into climate work, because a lot of students just don't have the psychological disposition for it. Maybe more so in France, I'm not sure. But I think one thing I've been trying to emphasize is the number of careers where you can take climate action is vast. You can be a very quiet person who loves a calculator and play an important role in the energy transition, just as much as you can be a political science specialist who goes to protests or who helps to write policies. And I think that one of our challenges with students is to help them see at the level of their own biography the different pathways toward action. And I think that also helps to resolve this contradiction between temporalities. A person can go to a meeting in the evening, study, do some work, apply for jobs, internships. Instead of thinking of this just in terms of political timelines, what does it mean to be 20 in 2020? And how does the life proceed? And what are the kinds of choices that individuals can make to join, whether it's a social movement or a profession or you name it? And I just want to say one last thing, echoing the earlier question. I think students don't just suffer from climate change, the psychological terror of it. They suffer from the fact that most of the people around them are in denial, the older people around them for the most part. I mean, students in my classes have told me they feel totally paralyzed in utter and complete despair. And they have maybe 5 classes to choose from in their entire undergraduate that feel relevant to them. Their parents, I mean, we know in the United States, anyway, it's a huge generational divide. The parents of most of my students aren't really thinking that much or talking that much about climate change. So I'm really glad that you're doing this work at Lyon, because especially the more senior people in academia need to transform the university so that I think students don't see a very big difference between Shell Oil and honestly the institution where they study, because both of them are saying, slow down, no big deal. And I think that is a huge problem. Climate change is terrifying enough. Imagine then being told by everybody that it's not a problem. It's like being in 1938 in Europe, I'm sure, and being told everything is going to be fine. So I think it's that widespread institutional denial that aggravates this anxiety so much for our students. And we have to find ways to alleviate that, to make change in our institutions.
Merci beaucoup, Daniel. Natacha, peut-être parce que tu as eu, toi, assez souvent et tu continues.
Thanks a lot, Daniel. You think a lot about the issue of expertise in the Anthropocene, how to make it accessible to non-academic people or people who don't think about training. What is your point of view about this ability that we may have or not to be heard by politicians? I'm definitely impressed by the coherence of our thinking on this issue, whether in the USA, in the UK, or in France, because, as you said, I've also seen for a year or two that awareness is raising among young people. This is in Saint-Étienne. Inside Lyon, I expect the same situation. And the fact that they have challenged us, thus provoking a movement in our institution. I was the first contact person with my students, and I used to say, I definitely agree with you, but I'm not sure it will be heard and something will happen. But nevertheless, something has happened in a more than 200-year-old institution. So this is a new phenomenon that has to be studied, and I call our sociologists to study this phenomenon. But also we understand a big gap between the older people, and I'm part of them, who are not as fast as the young generation. And my challenge is not that much to train young people, but to train older people, because if we want to disrupt the situation, as Juliette said, we shouldn't expect young people to become powerful, to have power. As Joël said, I've also had the opportunity to meet people from the Citizen Convention on Climate, and I was impressed by their level of understanding of the situation. And maybe we should force politicians, when they have a new position, to be trained on the situation in order to have a more critical viewpoint on social and ecological issues. We have 5 minutes left. Thank you, Natasha. So I would invite Yannick Klinberg to maybe not draw a final conclusion of our first debate, but to share a few remarks after listening to different colleagues. According to you, what are the perspectives of what has to be done in the future?
So I'm happy to wrap up a little today, but I honestly hope this is the beginning of a much bigger conversation. Not just from scholars, but also Michelle, from university administrators and leaders like you, because the truth is that I think what's remarkable about this conversation today is it was not much of a debate. Everyone who is doing this work now appreciates the shared problem we face and the challenges before us. And, although we each have our own perspective and come from a specific field or place, the problems are really quite similar. We've all emphasized the need to break down some disciplinary boundaries, to work with a different time frame, to give students a different model for engagement, and to educate people at different levels, from young people who need better scientific training before they come to universities, to veterans in professional fields who need to change the way they can act based on real knowledge today. And so one of the things that we're starting to see in the United States is a small number of universities that are opening up new things. Like at Columbia University, they're starting a climate school. It's not that climate change will be studied in departments. They're building an entire school that will have a faculty that works on this collectively. And I guess the way that we're going to make forward, Michelle, is that we're going to need university leaders to operate at that scale, and to really change the structure for instruction and for practice, for research, and for public engagement as well. And I think there's terrific incentive to do that, because there's money from governments and from the philanthropic sector and from the private sector to do this work. The universities have been exceedingly slow to respond. I think this point that Daniel made is right. And we should recognize that, those of us who have some capacity to shape universities administratively, that it's not just the science denial from fossil fuel companies and from politicians that's infuriating young people and making them dispirited. It's also our failure as people in higher education to live up to this challenge and to recognize how much it matters, and that business as usual is not good enough anymore. So I hope that in our next conversation, Michelle, in addition to great, scholars like, Rebecca Juliet and Daniel from the United States, we can invite some powerful administrators to explain what they're doing also.
Oui, je partage, Eric, cette analyse.
I definitely agree with this analysis. Thank you very much for sharing it. And I want to remind all our viewers that when I set up the Urban School of Lyon program, was the I wanted to call it also the Urban School of Anthropocene. Maybe it's more of an experiment in Lyon. I wanted to try a new university school in order to tackle the Anthropocene issues for the convergence of the approach and interest of colleagues from different fields, and also to welcome students coming from other fields and mobilizing them in order to be players of the construction of this program and this school. I don't know if I've achieved my goal, but in the framework of this festival we have been organizing for 3 years at the end of January. It's a kind of open university, open school, allowing anyone to understand the challenge in knowledge and action when we speak about Anthropocene. So thanks a lot, Eric, for co-organizing this workshop. I want to thank all my colleagues who have spoken, and I think, as you've said, that it's just a starting point. And for the next workshop, we will have academic people, but also politicians, in order to go on with our reflection. I want to thank everyone. Talk to you soon, Eric. I think tomorrow you'll be with us again. And I want to thank all the technicians who have given us the opportunity to speak between continents, between the USA, the UK, and Lyon. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. And I want to remind the public that this workshop has been recorded and is available on podcasts.